Sorry for our delay. The last panel just couldn't believe they were tarrying. Like it was a church convention, and we didn't want to push them out because they were elders.
Amen.
We want to stay blessed.
We want to stay blessed. We don't want to have problems, you know.
Right. The elderly folk.
Okay. But we will have time. We have plenty of time for our panel. Okay, welcome to the Baraka's Blues People at 50, Race, Rhythm, and Views in the Study of African American Music Culture today. I want to basically give a nice little intro, and then we'll talk about the format of our roundtable session today. I was very fortunate to gather a brilliant group of emerging and young scholars in African American music, a veritable literary and ethnological super friends representing a wide array of genres, research interests, levels of community engagement online and in the real world. And as stated in the roundtable abstract, 2 years ago marked the 50th anniversary of the publication of the late Amiri Baraka's Blues People, Negro Music in White America. Recognized as a watershed text, okay, hold on. Sorry about that. We got people trying to find the panel, sorry about that. No.
Teamwork makes it
Yeah, I didn't recognize the area code.
No guy.
Recognized as the watershed text in African American music, history, and cultural expressions in the United States, Baraka posited, like Harlem Renaissance writer Sterling Brown and others before him, that the history of African Americans is embedded and carried in their music and expressive culture. Blues People examines that history through the multiple lenses of performance culture, spirituality, sociology, and commodification. It follows the musical and cultural history of Africans becoming Americans, as well as America's Africanization through its engagement with Black music, even in times when its engagement with actual Black people tended to be tenuous at best. Generations of ethnomusicologists have continued the conversations Baraka initiated, and incidentally, 2 years prior to his launching of the activist conscious Black arts movement in 1965. This roundtable will include 5 scholars who represent various trajectories of theoretical thought and applied scholarship that have emerged in the wake of new Black music genres, subcultures, previously understudied areas, and shifting social and racial climates in America. The position papers and subsequent discussion will include research topics such as the analysis of Black literature through the lens of hip-hop aesthetics, community networks among Black classical instrumentalists and composers, masculinities and critiques of heteronormative theology and gospel music performance, independent soul music scenes, and challenges to music and worship in the post-civil rights Black church. Overall, it is hoped that the Baraka's Blues People can serve as a pivot point or fulcrum for our discussions today around current and contemporary research, methodologies, community engagement models, and activism by interdisciplinary scholars. Our format will be to allow each of the panels to give a brief position papers and then open the floor up for responses, questions, and discussions. And so we will start with our first presenter, Dr. Regina Bradley. Regina Bradley is an assistant professor of African American literature at Armstrong State University. She is also a recipient of the Nasir Jones Hip Hop Fellowship at Harvard University this spring 2016. Clap it up. Thank you. Dr. Bradley earned her doctorate in African American literature from Florida State University, a master's in African American and African diaspora studies from Indiana University Bloomington, and is a third-generation graduate from the unsinkable Albany State University. She writes about post-civil rights African American literature, the contemporary Black American South, pop culture, race, and sound in hip hop. Dr. Bradley is currently working on her first book, tentatively titled Chronicling Stankonia, Recognizing Americans Hip Hop South, a project that uses hip hop to update the framework for understanding the post-civil rights American South. Known on social media as Red Clay Scholar, a nod to her Georgia upbringing, Dr. Bradley's work is featured at www.redclayscholar.com. Welcome, Regina Bradley.
Thank you. Hello. You have to work with me. It's been a long 24 hours. I just got back in from Denver yesterday, and it messed with my spirit a little bit. There's not enough air up there. So basically, my position on Blues People is as a contemporary Southern Studies scholar, I'm interested in what Blues people look like in the post-civil rights, or what I'm theorizing in my current book project as the hip-hop South, post-civil rights South, the hip-hop South. And I've caught a lot of flack from elders, especially my grandmother, about the significance of hip-hop and how we articulate what Southernness and Blackness looks like in a contemporary space. So what I mean by post-civil rights is immediately is, you know, April 5th, 1968. The day after the assassination of Dr. King, for me, starts the post-civil rights South. And the reason being is that you have a collapse in this understanding of what it means to have like a monolithic Black leadership space, in addition to how do we address the South when our go-to key figure is no longer a part of that conversation. And one of the things that comes to mind is that with the death of Dr. King, you also have a lacking interest in what Southerners do, especially rural Southerners, during this time period, because they're no longer in the national eye, they're no longer sensationalized and associated with the violence, with the civil rights movement, etc. So we kind of go under the radar a little bit, and then the question becomes, well, what do Southern folks do after the civil rights movement? And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that question because, one, they don't have the language to articulate what Southerners do after the civil rights movement, and two, because the civil rights movement was such a widely and culturally recognizable facet of Southernness in the 20th century and beforehand, there's a hesitation in thinking about how to push the conversation forward after that. And as a member of the post-civil rights South, especially as a post-civil rights Southern Black person from Albany, Georgia, it's a question that I constantly have to grapple with. On the one hand, I have to think about the significance of the movement, and not to take anything away from the work that was done during the movement, but at the same time, I also need to find ways and space to articulate what it is that I'm trying to do as a Southerner. And that makes folks uncomfortable, especially in history and also in hip-hop. And this idea that, what do you mean that Southerners can contribute to hip-hop, which is this bi-coastal, eastern, northeastern, urban aesthetic? Where do Southerners fit into that if all they are known for are plantations, slaves, and Jim Crow? So it's like, how do we fit into these multiple conversations that are starting to take place, have been taking place, about how we understand what it means to be post-civil rights and Black? And kind of to use my own story as a background, I'm from what they call, ironically, the good life city, where good life means everything shuts down on Sunday after 6 because, you know, church. And you have kind of like it's like these ghosts of the civil rights movement. You have like these pageants, and you have, I went to Albany State University, but then it was Albany State College, and folks were getting expelled for participating in the movement. And then I was raised by my grandparents, and they were saying, education is your way out, and education is an opportunity, and education is a privilege. So I'm dealing with that additional kind of expectation. Don't waste this post-civil rights opportunity to do better than we did. So I'm also dealing with that. And then on the flip side, I have friends who aren't necessarily part of this Southern Black middle class aesthetic, who are listening to hip hop, who are listening to Field Mob, who are listening to Outkast and Pastor Troy. And as you can tell, I'm definitely a Georgia girl, because that was all that was on the mixtapes and everything like that. And there's no room to bring them together, because it seems like they are in two totally different conversations, and that is not the case. So what I argue is that hip-hop in the South is a way to de-romanticize the efforts of the civil rights movement, not necessarily taking away from what was contributed, because there was major contributions, but also not suggesting that it was the be-all, end-all kind of amelioration of the issues that were taking place, especially in the rural South. Especially coming from Albany, where Albany has one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates. It has a very high unemployment rate, very high HIV and AIDS rate, and all of that is taking place in addition to the fact that they were one of the milestones of the civil rights movement. If you didn't have Albany in the failure in the Albany civil rights movement, you would not have a national civil rights movement to talk about. Dr. King thought that he was fancy and came to Albany thinking that he could kind of ameliorate everything, and then he realized that Albany white people don't play. And somebody, you know, mysteriously paid his bail to just get him out. And now it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe there isn't a cookie cutter movement in these rural areas that are taking place. So how does that connect to, you know, this idea of blues folk? Blues folk wouldn't exist without the South. Let's just start there. And we continuously are using this idea of the blues aesthetic and finding the ways in which it builds like a blueprint, if you will. And thinking about folks who are rural Southern hip-hoppers, like Field Mob, like Big Crit, for example. I mean, his name stands for King Remembered in Time. This idea that Mississippi is lodged in both American and Southern cultural memory as this kind of backwards and inescapable space of racial violence. If you look at what is being contributed from Mississippi artists like Kiese Layman, like Jesmyn Ward, like Big Crit, like David Banner, John Jennings, there is still this underlying understanding that we still have a long way to go, but we're part of this conversation. And ultimately what Southerners are trying to do is show that they're part of this conversation. And my contribution, I don't necessarily see myself as an artist, I'm an artist-ish, is the Outcasted Conversations Project. And what the Outcasted Conversations Project did was to emphasize this idea of how Southerners, and there were a couple of Northerners in there, you know, because I'm nice like that, but the majority were Southern-bred, Southern-experienced scholars, and some of those folks, for example, Dr. Hadley is one of my guests. And the reason for doing that is, how can you tell me about being from the South and you're not from the South? There is something that you're going to miss. And yeah, I said it. Drop that mic real quick. And the reason being is that oftentimes we have these conversations about the South, we're often looking at it from a non-Southern perspective. And as a Southerner who has Southern sensibility, I need to be part of that conversation. Just because you said Dr. King came in this one time and he had this movement, well, what about the people who were actually there who weren't appreciative of the movement? What about the people who were there in Albany, for example, who couldn't participate openly because they were scared of losing their jobs and had kids, and this was something they were told me on the regular in my house, so we didn't actually march because we were scared if we were associated with the movement, we would lose our jobs and you would not have anything to eat at the house. How are we going to feed your brother and your aunt and etc.? So what we did was we did signs, we gave money, we did lunches, we did the low undercover efforts that are often overlooked in nationally recognized historical narratives of the movement, and because they weren't visually represented and because they weren't visually at the forefront, they're not part of the narrative, when without them we would have no narrative. So it's really interesting to think about why we like to overlook the contributions of Southern folk. So that was definitely one of the reasons that I like Outcasted Conversations, is that I showed that Southern folks still have stuff to say about their personal experiences. And of course, it's Outcast. I just wish I could just be like Outcast and just drop the mic, right? But when we have these conversations about hip-hop, Outcast is very rarely part of that conversation. Still, even the Academy, we're still trying to be like, hey, what about Outcast? What about their contributions? What about the ways that they introduce the possibility of a Southern urban aesthetic, which is what Imani Perry kind of plays around with in a lot of her parts in Prophets of the Hood, this idea that urban and Southernness can go together. The idea that Outkast was booed at the 95 Source Awards, and that they had to say the South got something to say, and we're going to use hip-hop to do that. So it's really important to think about how blues in a Southern tradition is an extension of the blues aesthetic that Baraka was talking about in his initial work, and also what the significance of the oral tradition is. When we think about the blues aesthetic, that's often associated with oral tradition. So with Outcasted Conversations and many of the works that me and my colleagues are doing, that oral tradition is so significant because for us, that is the way that history is preserved. That is the way that history continues. In a way, we're like critical griots. We're the ones who are making sure that these stories don't disappear, that these stories are told. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when people are like, oh, well, you know, what exactly did the South have to say? All they have to do is Google our work or Google Outcasted Conversation and realize that the South indeed does still have something to say. Thank you. Amen. I mean, I tried.
The word is like critical griots. Keep that critical griots in your mind. Definitely bring that back out. And I'm going to introduce our next presenter, critical griots. All right. Tweet that. Tweet that, please. Tweet that.
Left that right there in my heart.
Can you tell we're all friends?
Yes. Our next presenter, Burrell-Wood. Hold up. It's It's called double duty. It happens we have double duty. Ethnomusicologist Asia Burrell-Wood is currently a visiting fellow at the New School and lecturing a course in African American music at the Brooklyn College Conservatory of Music. Her scholarship has focused on how people of African descent have built new communities, expanded identity in the classical concertizing world. She has also extended her inquiry of musicians and composers in the contemporary New York jazz scene, considering how the first generation of jazz artists to come of age in hip-hop era are engaging the music of their time while growing new jazz audiences through technology and innovative live presentations. In her applied work, Asia has worked with and consulted on a number of projects with the Sphinx Organization, Revive Music Group, Harlem Arts Festival, Hip Hop Love Foundation, as well as worked with artists such as Wynton Marsalis and Diane Reeves. Today, she explores community networks among Black classical and jazz instrumentalists and composers while considering the intersection of race, identity, and perception as they relate to the concepts of Black music in the 21st century. Please welcome Asia.
So one of the first books that kind of are writings that inspired some of my work, starting with classical music, was James Trotter, Music and Some Highly Musical People. And that book is like 1881, and if you are familiar with it, you'll see that he'll go through and he actually presents all these Black artists, and many of them being concert artists, right? And in really in aims, he had the aims to kind of show the sophistication of the race, show the abilities of people of African descent, and through the fact that they were capable of, many of them, this Western art music, this classical music or European traditions. And then, of course, in thinking about blues people and Amiri Baraka, I started to really start to put these things in conversation, these two works in conversation in my head, at least, and that's where it stayed for a while. But, and I kind of was thinking about, okay, well, what about music and some highly musical blues people? Because when you're talking about classical music and then eventually jazz, these worlds kind of, especially today in this 21st century, we are, especially as people of African descent, we are coming from James Trotter's time, we are coming from Amiri Baraka's time as well, and living in this current context with all of that historical background and context, and how are we thinking about our identities and navigating, or how particularly these musicians, when their genres kind of operate within and outside of Black context in certain kinds of ways. So that's what I'm interested in. And so I'll start with what I love about blues people and how it's influenced my work is that it prioritizes the idea of race as a lived experience first, and in the context of significant historical shifts and positions Black music and cultural production as an expression of that specific experience. So I first wanted to understand the Black experience and music in terms of how individual contemporary Black classical instrumentalists and composers were engaging and navigating identity, cultural expressions, traditions, and historical narratives, which eventually led to include jazz as well, and also considerations of particular geographic locations of significant to Black culture. What's interesting to me in light of blues people is that both classical music and jazz, as it is presented today, have what I call an odd relationship to the concept of Black music, sometimes even tenuous. So I'll first briefly present my inquiry and findings in the world of classical music for Black musicians and composers, and then I'll shift to potential considerations for jazz today. So one of the most delightful and exciting discoveries in my work that I have been personally honored to learn is a story of a relative that helped me formulate some important questions leading to eventually much larger project. And so this is classical and jazz bassist Charles Burrell, who was born in 1920 and actually still around, and who was the first African American member of the Denver Symphony Orchestra. And he is amongst a very small group of musicians that have mastered both classical and jazz and had that success in his career. And so he's one of the first Blacks admitted to the faculty of San Francisco Conservatory of Music, And he's mentored and taught some of the finest musicians of the country. Among his students are late bassist, he's a bass player, late bassist Anthony Knight of the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, Major Hadley, and the late great Ray Brown, and other musicians he's guided that by Burrell are jazz pianist George Duke and his niece jazz vocalist Diane Reeves. So Charles' story, briefly, when he was 12, he heard the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra under the baton of the renowned Pierre Monteau at the time, and with the family's Crystal Radio. And he kind of resolved in that moment that he was going to play, and he's going to play one day under Monteau as well, that he idolized. And so he developed his skills on the bass in Detroit's famous Cass Tech High School, where at the time, 18, this would have been about in the 30s, and 18 of the principal musicians of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra taught. And so he had one teacher which agreed to teach him the bass if he promised not to play classical music. Okay? And yeah, let that marinate. So, and he then had another teacher, Oscar Lagasse, who encouraged him. So he just being, he's still stubborn as he is, he was just going to play classical music anyway. But one teacher actually taught him the wrong position to prevent him from mastering his instrument. If anybody, wrong position will really mess you up. So, so it took him more years to unlearn that, and while he was mastering classical music and also playing jazz in Detroit's Paradise Valley at a club called BJ's. So he was doing these things simultaneously. And so anyway, when I first learned of his life and work, I began to think about what's missing in the considerations and, more importantly, conversations of Black music and Blackness. Not only that, but how individual musicians and composers have experienced this for themselves. So what Charles Burrell's story also offered was historical perspective that helped to frame and contrast what later generations experienced. So I found that not only could many like Charles recount their unique experiences and relationships to race and music, but also came to seek and create community and networks based on those shared experiences. So because of this, my work investigates the complexity of cultural identity through music in relationship to the underpinnings of intergroup notions of race and power. So in this case, I consider the music-making activity of Western art music or classical music performers and composers of African descent in the 21st century, Detroit, New York, and which eventually also extends to jazz artists and communities amongst jazz artists. So by looking at classical music and composers of this type, I find that musicking, as theorized by Christopher Smalls, has provided a useful basis for discussing the formation of musical social networks that occupy a rarefied space between race and music. So the consideration of such a network or community challenges predominant notions of one, power, in the form of musical knowledge and ability, and two, music as the basis for cultural identity. So I argue that this particular community network and community amongst classical musicians, when enacted, not only challenges and affirms social relationships to music and meaning through music making, but can effectively redistribute power of cultural systems in a way that begins significantly to alter cultural relationships to narratives of power and identity. So this community of individuals, these classical musicians, French horn players, cellists, and whatnot, when enacted and operates simultaneously within and outside of Black and Western European cultural contexts. In doing so, this community network provides a basis for interpreting the ways in which music making functions to rewrite Black cultural narratives across geographic boundaries, not only as a counter-hegemonic act that opposes power, but as a social process that in fact lays claim to that power. Okay, so seeing through the lens of race, I feel like we, as we often do, misunderstand and misrepresent culture and race. Great. So, so anyway, all I have to say, it seems absurd to consider, for example, that that Black is in contradiction to the French horn, but the true and unfortunate contradiction has actually been perspectives on race and music. And so I'll share later some of the things that my informants have said, but I'll kind of close out just in a few things with jazz. So in basically, I've been also interested in those musicians and composers who have come of age during the hip-hop era, jazz musicians. So the consideration findings that have manifested as a result of my work with Black classical musicians has also led inquiry into today's jazz musicians who operate in performance spaces where Blackness is not necessarily affirmed either. In contrast to classical music performative spaces, Blackness is not negated in the exact same way. However, talent, technique, musical ideas are still evaluated in terms that offer insight to the experience of both classical and jazz musicians. So in this jazz space, Black, for example, can be seen as an authenticity marker for the origins of the music form. However, musical ideas are read as innate, and when musicians and composers extend themselves beyond the set aesthetic boundaries, they can also run the risk of being misinterpreted as subpar attempts. So proficiency can be read as something that comes natural rather than something that is worked for or something that is attained through high levels of concentration, diligence, practice, skill honing. That's what shedding is. So I'll close here and just say that what I'd like to discover is how community and networks function in these spaces and engages or does not engage the concept of Black music. And much of what I'd be able to do simply wouldn't be possible without blues people and much of Amiri Baraka's work. So I believe that ultimately Amiri Baraka's work has set forth several ways in which to interpret and investigate Black cultural production and narratives in music that carry lasting significance and implications that have yet to be fully unearthed. And we're still here doing that. Thank you.
All right, great stuff, great stuff. Okay, I'm gonna set up something for our next presenter in a second. Give me a moment.
You were right, I was wrong.
Hey, it's okay.
You were right.
It's all love, it's all love. That's why we're here, you fabulous. You want to start with it? You want to start with it, or
It's toward the beginning, but
Did you want to start before I? That's what the beginning.
yeah.
I'll be DJ. I'll be DJ.
God bless you.
This video.
Okay.
So intense.
Oh yeah,
Here we go.
family reunion.
All right. Our next presenter is Dr. Alisha Lola Jones.
Hallelujah.
Yeah, exactly. Very recently minted, fresh in the fold. She is an assistant professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. Jones is a graduate of the Oberlin Conservatory, the Yale Divinity School, and the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, where she received her Master's of Divinity degree and earned her PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Chicago. She is completing a manuscript entitled, wait for it, Peculiar People, Meaning, Masculinity, and the Competence in Gender Gospel Performance.
Yes, ma'am.
Her research breaks ground by analyzing the role of gospel music making in constructing and renegotiating gender identity among Black men. Jones's research interests include musical masculinities, music and theology, the music industry, music of the African diaspora, and emerging research on music and future foodways in conjunction with the Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley. This past year, Jones received academic acclaim and support through 6 research fellowships that included the Andrew Mellon Dissertation Fellowship, a Martin Marty Jr. Fellowship, and an innovation grant from the University of Chicago. Welcome, Dr. Jones.
It's so great to be here. In many ways, I'm experiencing this uncanny sort of intersectionality, seeing my sister scholars here, sisters in several ways, and then seeing elders here in academia who have taken time away from the luncheon. Yes, you, sir, Dr. McNeil. Dr. Neal. And then my colleagues in religion, Dr. Mingo, Dr. Zach, thank you so much for coming. And then my interlocutors, my conversation partners, Dr. McNeil, Dr. Neal, Dr. McNeil, who works at Ebenezer Baptist Church, this storied Ebenezer Baptist Church. And my childhood friend, Daniel Moore, producer, songwriter extraordinaire. I'm so godly proud of you. I don't get a chance to share this sort of stuff with these families, so I'm kind of excited. In my talk, I will provide an overview of my research and its engagement with Amiri Baraka's work through one of my case studies. And then I look forward to more discussion during our roundtable about other aspects of my research. For many Christians, gospel music is a means of worshiping God and constructing identity. My book manuscript entitled Peculiar People, Meaning, Masculinity, and Competence in Gendered Gospel Performance breaks ground by examining the performative mechanisms through which creative processes unfold in some symbolically contested ritual context as Black men position themselves along a spectrum of gender identities. Through multi-sensory enactments of song, speech, gesture, and attire, men also define themselves as peculiar and affirm their fitness to minister as servants of God. In this context, peculiarity thus refers to those who are set apart for God's use. However, I argue for the applicability of a wider meaning of the term, one that gives voice to the gender and sexual differences articulated by those central to my study. Drawing on trans-congregational and trans-denominational ethnography in Chicago and DC, for example, this research highlights the ways in which peculiar people traverse tightly knit social networks to renegotiate their identities through and beyond the worship experience. Moreover, it argues that as gospel performances are coded and read as queer, they become loci of nuanced protest, facilitating a striking critique of heteropatriarchal theology while affording Black men opportunities for greater access and visibility. Black gospel artists and fans often construct narratives pertaining to the performance of gender and sexuality. Although women play an important role in shaping these narratives, I have found that conversations about gender and sexuality in Black gospel music most often center on the sexual orientation of men. How does gospel music making allow Black men to construct alternative masculinity or manhood, even as audiences selectively read queerness into their sounds and gestures? Homosexuality is discussed almost solely as a men's issue and in terms of men's inadequacy. Doubts about a man's straight sexual orientation often surface from observing his embodied musical performance, and many jokes circulate about flamboyant gospel singers and choir directors. I have also noticed that homosexuality becomes a hot topic following well-publicized sex scandals involving prominent religious leaders. I approach this topic with a great deal of caution, in part because I sense that my research could be the only encounter that many readers and scholars will have with gospel music. Moreover, my consultants often express a belief that the sexual ambiguity of many church performers and the outing of popular artists negatively affect the evangelical witness of gospel music. Keenly aware of the politics of my work and its potential influence on perceptions of religion, race, and gender within both the Black church and the academy, the religion scholars, I know y'all are here. I wish to avoid reascribing stereotypical notions of Black church culture as pathological or of Black men as always deceptive and or on the down low. I want to emphasize that Black Christianity is diverse and complex, as are other spiritual traditions. I also see this book project as an empowering opportunity to offer a nuanced representation of Black Christian men and their music making. And it is empowering for me as a Black female scholar who is sympathetic to womanist and feminist issues. Now, as I reviewed Amiri Baraka's Blues People for this year's ASALH roundtable, I was drawn to Baraka's reflection on the ways in which Black middle-class values influence the the formation of Black religiosity, and the distribution of respectability politics. Baraka examined Black upward mobility and pointed out social disconnects, the lived experiences of Black folk. With regard to my research on historically Black Pentecostal denominations, it has been well documented by religious scholars such as Calvin White Jr. that the Church of God in Christ musicians, for example, in the US deal with the politics of respectability, but the negotiation of these politics and theological tensions around gender and sexuality have not been in ethnomusicological research on gospel music. Baraka's considerations of respectability politics call to mind the discourses generated from the released Church of God in Christ deliverance footage on Andrew Caldwell that was released last year, and the subsequent musicians' music that was produced, which focused on his self-identified delivered status. I would like to share a portion of one of my case studies on what I call church realness, and the performance of discretionary devices in which Black men negotiate heteropatriarchy in their performances that equips me and other scholars with analytical tools to interpret the tensions performed in the deliverance moment. I've examined ethnography of the self-identified delivered homosexual preacher singer Donnie McClurkin's vocality during a revival at St. Sabina in Chicago. I situated his performance of noticeably heteropatriarchal language in Kojic practices. Deliverance sermons and altar calls by preachers such as evangelist Francis Kelly are geared toward effeminate or feminine men or gay men and boys who she and other preachers call musical, or problematically they call them church sissies. And it is a fixture during the annual Kojic conventions. In my research, I considered the 102nd Church of God in Christ convention in Memphis, Tennessee in 2012, when Pastor Donnie McClurkin claimed he was entrenched in contemporary gay gospel music networks as a self-identified forefather. He stopped the music and used harsh language to admonish perceived queer attendees. It is delivered as an impromptu and revelatory proclamation, the way he does it. The sermon was, however, a script that is usually performed in third person at the Kojic convocations. I use this clip to show his first person admission of the music-centered perception about the ways in which the youths explore their sexuality at the 30-second mark. I apologize for the quality of the video. That's fine, right there's fine.
Right here.
Yeah.
Before you come, hold on one moment. Before you come. We are in a very, very dangerous point, and our children are being lost. But they're being lost in the house. They're being lost in the house. They're being lost right here in the house. And they're covered by music. And they're covered by gifts. But they're being lost in the house. They have been failed on many, many, many points. They have been failed on many, many points. They have been raised without fathers. They have been left empty and hurt. And the very ones of us who have been their forefathers have failed. Hear me, please. Hear me, please. The very ones of us generations failed, myself included. And now they're being tainted by people in their generation.
In the interest of time, I wish we could listen to a little bit more. But in the interest,
Where did you ramble on YouTube?
yeah, okay. Since his testified deliverance from homosexuality in the early 2000s, Pastor McClurkin has been outspoken about young men and women being disproportionately turned out or introduced to homosexuality in the church. He believes that youths are drawn to quote-unquote perverted sexual exploration at church-sponsored musical events. McClurkin's remarks also addressed preacher-singer Toney's recent self-disclosure at the time about his sexual orientation. McClurkin is one of several Pentecostal preacher musicians, including officials in Toney's former Pentecostal Assemblies of the World organization, that have deemed Toney as being of reprobate mind. And I'm going to skip over that. There's a problem with Toney. He's calling him out. My point here is neither to dispute nor affirm McClurkin's self-identification as delivered from homosexuality. I argue, however, that McClurkin's ex-gay label may deflect from observers' sense that he maintains the SGL, or same-gender-loving social knowledge, maneuvers, and performance that heteropatriarchal gospel music patrons may not detect. With his exhortation, Pastor McClurkin reads the SGL and lesbian believers in the event. Read is a popular black gay vernacular for finding a flaw in someone or thing, often in a performative manner. McClurkin preaches that SGL, or gay sexual orientation, is not God's ideal or natural, and thus being gay is not a legitimate identity. Adapting what registered to many who are SGL in their vernacular and posture, McClurkin chastises them about what they already know about themselves. He uses several signifiers that evoke black, gay, ball, and SGL cultural terms such as house, father, turned out, kids, children, and real. I'm struck by the manner with which Pastor McClurkin challenges the notion that a person's self-identification as gay is real. In closing, I use this particular case study to argue that some queer men manage potential social dissonance by deploying discretionary devices that distance them from perceived queerness. On the one hand, these discretionary devices are empowering for men, and that they are tools for privately engaging one another in public. On the other hand, discretionary devices are disempowering for those who are left out of what Richard Schechner would call a form of dark play. Quote, playing in the dark means that some of the players don't know they are playing. Dark fantasy involves fantasy, risk, luck, daring, invention, and deception. Dark play may be entirely private, known to the player alone. Dark play rewards its players by means of deceit, disruption, and excess, end quote. Discretionary devices allow men to be discreet about telling the truth of who they are, to not just their church family, but also to those to which they are emotionally attached. Through my ethnomusicological research, I offer new ways of analyzing men's gender and sexuality, as each aspect of their identity is discreetly performed in a manner that each of their religious and social communities can recognize. I look forward to the conversation that is to follow during this roundtable and question and answer, and I hope to discuss with you a bit more about the book project and the ways in which I use my research to engage the public. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Dr. Regina Johnson, who is a joint appointed assistant professor of ethnomusicology in the School of Music and in the African American Studies program at the University of South Carolina. She specializes in African American and African music, and her research interests include music and worship in African American churches, musical change and identity in Black popular music, music in African American megachurches, sacred music in the African diaspora, and community archiving. A multi-instrumentalist, she has performed professionally with artists and ensembles from a variety of genres, including the Southeast Symphony Orchestra of Metropolitan Los Angeles, the Gospel Music Workshop of America, and the Francisco Aguabellas Come through. Afro-Cuban folklore group. She has published articles in the Black Music Research Journal, the British Forum for Ethnomusicology, and the Grove Dictionary of American Music, and is currently working on a book manuscript, Worship Waves, Navigating Identities, Music in the Black Church at the Turn of the 21st Century. Using multi-sided ethnographic research in several cities, Worship Waves seeks to highlight the impact of post-civil rights era cultural movements and socio-political changes on the state of music performance, transmission, and worship traditions in the Black church of the 21st century. Dr. Johnson.
I'd like to give a shout out to Dr. Mark Neal for inspiring this use of the iPad. I had come up a couple of years ago. I think I got to catch up. So I'm going to go ahead and start. All right. For me, I believe the biggest impact, I'm going to stand because it's a bright light seat, so I'm going to stand up here for it. The biggest impact, exactly, the biggest impact of blues people had on my research and how I engage with Black music research and scholarship kind of has to do with this phrase he used in the text, in the very beginning of the text, quote, looking back while looking forward, end quote. And it's very simple, and of course, if you've ever had to do a literature review or historical overview of a topic, you say, of course, that's what you do, it's duh. But for me, what Baraka was getting at spoke to your position as a scholar, as well as a reminder to be conscious that as you move forward and engage Black music from multiple vantage points or disciplines, to always be conscious of where the music and the people have been and where they are going. View the past as roadmap to the present and future and not static, disjointed signposts. Yes. So, thank you. See, I love that. That's what I was trying to do. Thank you. It impacted how I looked at issues of tradition and change from a methodological perspective. Just because many people may think something is new or represents some great departure from tradition, it may also just be the case of another variation on the contextualized theme. It pushed me to look for just as much of the past in historical context as I was documenting the present and current trends. So when I began my doctoral research on African American megachurches in Los Angeles, I did not assume that megachurches were automatically a new phenomenon for Black people. For example, understanding the central role of the Black church in America and African American communities right after emancipation, and then looking at how the Hartford Institute of Religion Research was defining so-called distinctiveness of megachurches in relation to the average sized churches today and how they operate, one can make the case that many historic Black churches all over the country have operated in similar ways, particularly in the realms of the level of involvement African American churches had in the everyday lives of their congregants, beyond just the religious and spiritual rituals of Sunday morning worship. The Black church was a center for politics, commerce, activism, resources, protection, and cultural affirmation, and very big churches with thousands of members, especially in urban areas, could be found all over America as early as the Great Depression. Some come to mind quickly for our ASALH group, Hadley Temple in Philadelphia, Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago, on down to the Civil Rights Movement where you have Reverend Clay Evans Church, Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church in Chicago, as well as C.L. Franklin's church in Detroit, the pastor with the $1 Million Voice. How do you get $1 Million Voice? A lot of people buying his records from his Sunday services, as well as becoming the father of the future Gleaner Soul. So the large church phenomenon in many Black communities predated the mid-century church growth movement we now say is responsible for today's megachurches. As a researcher, my drive was to dually observe how these churches were continuing traditions, but just on a larger scale, as well as allowing for moments to explore if there was indeed innovation or a stepping away from tradition. Could today's worship landscapes represent a convergence of multiple influences, and are these influences internal, external, or both? So understanding that the church holds a particular cultural capital for Black people that will also impact how, in the cases of Black megachurches, how they interact as members of these churches, as well as how the community at large critiques or engages these churches. So, however, understanding that while megachurches are highly visible for good and bad reasons, and their ability to sustain large operational bases, the talk of much debate, they are still a minority account in the overall landscape of the Black Christian church experience in America today. And even in contemporary settings for music and worship in the Black church, well under 10%, and many stand far outside of the spotlight of church and religious celebrities. So if I assume that Black megachurches is also a part of a longer legacy in the Black experience in America and not some late century departure, and that the music that takes place most of the time in these large churches are, for the most part, similar in many ways to what is seen in average-sized churches. What other social and cultural factors are driving their growth and increase across the landscape? What theological shifts or reorientations are at play? And how is the music of the church not only sonically referencing these things, but also moreover lyrically informing and reflecting these things? For example, is it truly neo-Pentecostalism as a theological orientation that is being adopted across denominational lines, or neo-Pentecostal believers just being more acceptable of excuse me, I skipped a line, go back and read that again. For example, is it truly neo-Pentecostalism as a theological orientation that is being adopted across denominational lines, or is it the broader acceptance of the music created and innovated by Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal believers being just more acceptable on Sunday mornings because of their vast contributions to gospel music industry for the last 40 years? Especially after the golden age of gospel music in the post-World War II America, where we see Pentecostalism born and raised gospel artists taking gospel music to unheard sights, sounds, spaces inside and outside the Black community, nationally and internationally. And so I'm going to basically shoot out a couple of my remaining time, shoot out some questions I'm dealing with my manuscript, as well as some things that we're looking at in the scholarship, me and other colleagues. This first is, for example, one of the driving forces of my manuscript is, what does music and worship look like in the post-Oh Happy Day Black church? Where is the ethnographic work? Not just the biographical work on recording artists and groups. Where is the ethnographic work of what's happening in churches at this point? On a Sunday to Sunday, Wednesday night to Thursday night, Saturday morning basis, what's happening in the churches? How did the crack epidemic and the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s and early 1990s impact the youth choir and community choir movement that dominated the music that was being created for church worship use? How, particularly if you think about as far back as 1960s, we had community choir, church choirs putting out songs like Peace Be Still, that's still sung every Sunday morning, or How I Got Over. We're singing those songs, and those are choir-based songs. What happens when we have those groups starting to disappear from the church landscape? And also, how does this blow to the choir tradition lend itself to the current controversies where praise teams are now supplanting the use of church choirs in some Black churches? Are the perennial issues around music ministry and worship practices in the Black church exacerbating newer challenges to music and worship in the post-soul era Black church? And I'm also interested in, rewriting or writing in the Black contributions to praise and worship music, as well as the role of revival and congregational singing via neo-traditional gospel and choir-driven praise and worship music, as opposed to what we have in liturgical studies and congregational music studies, people talking about worship wars. In the Black church experience, I want to look at the worship waves. You know, what impacted the current successes and challenges to music ministry. So when we think about people like the trailblazers, like the late Andre Crouch, who we just lost this year, Andre and Sandra Crouch's contributions and foundational contributions and organizational contributions to praise and worship, as well as people we don't hear about, like Thomas Whitfield, and what he brought as far as bringing praise and worship to choirs in Black church context. Actual churches like the West Angeles Church of God in Christ, who also were very interested in bringing neo-traditional gospel to younger audiences and having people like Bishop Charles Blake saying, I want to give the music back to the people, not just the talented people in this choir platform. And lastly, theological movements like the Full Baptist Gospel Church, Full Gospel Baptist Church Fellowship, who basically gave us a neo-Pentecostalism with the actual soundtrack. They actually put out records when they were founded and collaborating, giving us people like Byron Cage and songs for church use around this movement of neo-Pentecostalism happening that started to get outside of just Kojic circles or Pentecostal circles, moving into the Baptist circles, missionary Baptist circles, the AME circles. And lastly, I want to close with another wonderful movement, because we have archivists in the audience, and I want to speak to that. With advancements in digitization and data storage, as well as cross-institutional initiatives, there has been an increase in gospel music archiving over the last 10 years alone. In 2004, there was the UCLA Ethnomusic College's Archives Gospel Archiving in Los Angeles project, in conjunction with the legendary Dr. Margaret Pleasant DeRoe, Once again, she's alive. She's the woman who wrote the song, "If It Had Not Been for the Lord on My Side, Where Would I Be?" As well as Clean Heart. You probably sing her songs at Christmas, and also at Easter. And so she's alive, and we can basically partner with her at UCLA to get a lot of her collection, as well as document a year in the life of her organization. The next project that happened in 2007, kind of inspired by the UCLA project, was the University of South Carolina's Gospel Music History Archive. Once again, in conjunction with another institution, Indiana University's Archives of African American Music and Culture. So we have these cross, initiatives happening and engaging with the community of actual people like the ward singers and bringing them in to give their holdings as well as give talks. And then lastly, in 2008, one of the larger, more contemporary and even highly digitized projects, Baylor University's Black Gospel Music Restoration Project was launched and has since become a contributing partner in the Smithsonian National Museum for African American History and Culture when it opens next year, and bringing in those collections of that nice gospel era of, there we go. The gospel era of the 1930s up into the 60s, the actual recordings and digitizing those and actually taking from people's collections in garages, in attics, and old records, and actually digitizing them and sending them back free of charge, and actually having them on holding and accessible through things like iTunes University. So I'm gonna, that's through my thoughts. We're gonna basically put a pin in that, and we're gonna welcome our last presenter, the wonderful, okay. And this is but that's a little bit about my work, but I want to go ahead and make sure we have time for questions and get into our last speaker presenter extraordinaire, Dr. Fredara Hadley.
That's my friend.
I know her. She is an ethnomusicologist and visiting assistant professor at Oberlin College. She specializes in researching, writing, and teaching African American popular music. She specializes in her dissertation entitled "Reframing the Narrative, Defining African American Alternative Music in the 21st Century Atlanta," explored the independent soul music scene in Atlanta and its relationship with commercial hip-hop music. Fredara is the founder of Juxi, a company through which she hosts a weekly radio show and provides tours of New York City through the lens of African American music. She's the managing editor of Guy Ramsey's Musicology.com site, a web platform that provides thoughtful analysis in African American music through the lens of musicology. Fredara has been a regular contributor to OK Player, Revivalist, and Pop Matters. Committed to sharing knowledge about Black music by any means possible, Fredara conducted research for the Harlem Stage, the African Burial Ground Memorial, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Carnegie Hall, and 651 Arts. She shared her passion for Black music on HuffPost Live and Essence Magazine. Please welcome Dr. Hadley.
Poems are bullshit unless they have teeth or trees or lemons piled on a step. That's the first line from Amiri Baraka's poem Black Music, and it always resonated with me, the idea that something, this construct that we have of something, poetry being literary and beautiful, and it certainly can be that, is being so tangible and present in our physical world. And so I take from that, and I do often say this to myself, because I do talk to myself, and I say, I want ethnomusicology that has teeth, something that actually has bite, something that actually has resonance. I feel like we are all in a privileged space to be sitting in this room and have access to the wonderful education and degrees that we've been able to accrue, but as Amiri Baraka would also often ask, what have you done for Black people today?
Come on.
My mother, Clara S. Hadley, is a retired professor of English literature. That means I grew up in a house that doubled as a library that was chock full of Shakespeare, Chaucer, and the canon of classics that all learned people are supposed to know. But then one day, doesn't every salvation story start? But then one day, I came across a book that I somehow overlooked. It was. I need a Hammond B3 and
Thank you.
right?
See the church doors opening up.
Right there. I came across a book that I'd overlooked, and it was Leroy Jones's Blues People. It was not an overstatement to say that my discovery, because it already did exist, I wasn't Columbusing it, of blues people, set me on a trajectory towards becoming an ethnomusicologist who does research and write and teach about Black American music. In the context of Jones's life, Blues People is one of the last testaments of Leroy Jones. Published in 1963, it is still the early, for context here, it's still the early days of the turbulent 1960s. Malcolm X still walks the earth. Martin Luther King Jr. is planning the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Landmark civil rights legislation is still over a year away. President John F. Kennedy unknowingly is living in his last days. And Black folks are still Negroes, and Leroy Jones is not yet Amiri Baraka. So in very important ways, Jones's assertion that Blues People is a theoretical endeavor is actually true. Theoretical only in the sense that none of the questions it poses can be said to have definitive answers for all of time. But of course he's right in the big questions and the peculiarities of what it means to be a legally free Black person in a country where you were never intended to be free. So how we get to my work is that, and I break this up into three sections, and the problem with going last is you want to comment on what everybody else said and be like, well, what about? But I will try to do the task at hand. And I look at my work in three broad categories that obviously overlap and connect in all kinds of crazy ways. And so I'm going to talk through my scholarship because that really is the foundation for how we get to the latter two pieces of me, I guess. And the last two would be pedagogy and community engagement. As Dr. Johnson so eloquently stated, my dissertation research focuses on the independent soul music scene here in Atlanta, Georgia. And really what I'm thinking about from Blues People and how I frame a lot of my work is this idea of the changing sound, right? Similar to what Birgitta was speaking about, looking back to look forward, not assuming that the things that I'm encountering and the things that I'm thinking about haven't happened in some kind of way in some previous context. And not only looking to the body of literature, which is of course our task as scholars, but listening to the community stories as well to help frame what I'm encountering in my own fieldwork. The other part about it is, and this is what I'll get into more when I talk about pedagogy, is the importance of counter-narrative. One, realizing that there already is a narrative and how we intersect and contest that narrative, and sometimes actually converge with that narrative, is hugely important. So, lost my place. So I feel very strongly that in our scholarship, particularly those of us who do research about Black people and Black people's lives, and by extension for me, Black people's music, we should look to see what music people are creating and the relevance that they develop with that music in their own lives. Baraka did not shy away from the blood and guts of men and women who made up the music that we discuss. While as scholars, we must account for the postmodern, socio-political, and historical inferences and implications of the music we study, we should also continue to look outside of the music industrial complex to investigate the music that Black people are creating that exists outside of that capitalist paradigm, or at least on the periphery of, and further investigate how Black experiences are constructed in those spaces. I'm grateful to the work of scholars such as Maureen Mann, who explores the meaning of rock music in contemporary Black life, E. Patrick Johnson, who examines the transformation of nightclub spaces into sacred spaces for Black gay men who have been ostracized from African American Black churches in lots of cases. A nod to your work and what you're doing, obviously. In my own work, I attempt to further this line of inquiry by investigating the function of soul music among African Americans in this very city who know very well that their music is not going to garner the commercial and historical accolades of their hip hop, R&B, in this contemporary moment counterparts. But Atlanta is really special because there are few cities that really at this moment, there is no other city that has as many different genres percolating that have some level of either community support or industrial support. And so what I was really trying to look at here in Atlanta was using genre as a lens to look at intra-racial Black diversity. How do these genres kind of coexist or rub up against and overlap and diverge among one another in this geographical space? I found that,